Okay, what we're looking at today is paper 1, question 3. This is the Mr. Fisher extract, and what I wanted to do was to go through this with you, annotation of the question, annotation of the extract, and to go through a sample answer with you so that you're clear on exactly what you have to do. So this is question 3 on paper 1, and the question reads, you now need to think about the whole of the source. So I've underlined the whole of the source. The text is from the beginning of a short story, so we understand the context of the extract. And the question, which will always be the same, how has the writer structured the text to interest you as a reader? Then the same bullet points you'll always find. You could write about what the writer focuses your attention on at the beginning of the source, which I've underlined, how I've underlined, and why also circled. How and why the writer changes this focus as the source develops. Those two are absolutely imperative. And any other structural features that interest you. 8 marks. Okay, so we're going to have a look back at the extract now to see how the writer has structured the extract to interest us as readers. What I always focus on here as a reminder is the question what and why. So what is the writer showing us, and why are they showing us that in that particular order? So we're going to start with the first bullet point, which was about what the reader shows us, or what the reader focuses our attention on at the beginning of the extract. So we're looking here at these 2 paragraphs really before he changes the focus there. So the first 2 paragraphs really, we're looking at what the writer is showing us, what the writer is focusing on here, and why are they focusing on that in light of the rest of the extract. So I've annotated some of this in relation to the question. Let's go through that. So Mr. Fisher. So I've circled that because obviously we know that Mr. Fisher is the focal character, the central element of this extract. It's about Mr. Fisher, so they're focusing on his character. Mr. Fisher lived alone in a small terrace house in the centre of town. So I've made a comment there that his life is quite modest. There's a focus really on him and his fairly average kind of life really in relation to the job that he does. So he lives alone, small terrace house, centre of town, didn't own a car, preferred to do as much as he could of his weekend marking in the form room after school. Even so, there were usually 2 or 3 stacks of books and papers to take home on the bus, which I've underlined because I've suggested it demonstrates his dedication to his job. So this is a man who's very sort of simple, modest life experiences, doesn't have a car, and it seems that he spends much of his time dedicated to his work. So a conscientious and dedicated teacher. It has been a disappointing term at St Oswald's. So I've underlined that because there's a sense of disillusionment here growing with this very modest and very simple life, a dedication to teaching, and a kind of a growing sense of unhappiness perhaps with the teaching that he's doing. For most of the boys in 3F, creative writing was on a par with country dancing and food technology. He tried to engage their interest, but books just didn't seem to kindle the same enthusiasm as they had in the old days. So this kind of underlines and elaborates on the disappointing term, because the students that he teaches are not interested in creative writing in the same way that he was, or in the same way that students were in the so-called old days. So that is what, that's the what. The fact that the writer is focusing our attention on Mr. Fisher, simple life, modest background, dedicated teacher, and a sense of disillusionment at the what he's really doing here is battling the sense of inertia that the students are demonstrating. That's the what. So the next question really should be, why is the writer focusing in on that? Well, knowing what we know about the extracts, we will have read it a few times by now. We know that what happens is he goes back here in time, in his memory, to when he believes stories and writing was exciting and thrilling and creative and dramatic. And then it talks about the Tibbets homework that he reads. He doesn't expect much from it, and actually it does really shock him when he does read it. So why the writer creates this sense of a bored, perhaps disillusioned teacher in a modest background, dedicated their life to teaching, is, I think, because it underscores this real sense of I don't know, that he's not really expecting anything much from his students. And then when it does happen, when Tibbitt's work is so fantastic, it really emphasises that contrast between his expectations and the reality of Tibbitt's work. And I also think it's an interesting way of contrasting the present to the past. And this past time that he suggests is illuminating, exploding, creative, vivid, and so on. So we now know what the writer focuses our attention and why. So that's going to be the focus of our very first paragraph. So I've written this already, and I'm just going to read this through with you, hopefully demonstrate some of the techniques that you need to be incorporating in your answer. So the writer focuses our attention on Mr. Fisher's small life and his dedication to his job at the beginning of the source. So I've utilised some of the wording from the question, this reference to focus and attention, in order to start my topic sentence. The opening phrase, Mr. Fisher lived alone, establishes him as the focus for the extract, and the description of his diligence and dedication is evident when it mentions the 2 or 3 stacks of books to take home. So that is what. So I've established what the focus is on here. The writer creates this focus on the single character Fisher and his modest life in order to, so now comes the why, emphasise the impact that reading Tibbitt's work later truly has. It also shows, we're here, the mundane experience of marking that corresponds to the boring writing that he has to mark, further underlining how impactful Tibbitt's work is. So we've established what the writer's focusing in on here, and why are they doing it in that way? Why have they chosen to focus in on it there in relation to the rest of the text? So we now know that the second bullet point, how and why the writer changes this focus, we need to go back to the extract. So we've started with the beginning point here, and I've already said that one of the possible changes in focus happens here with this paragraph where Mr. Fisher has this flashback, a golden time where stories and creative writing were vivid, bright, exciting and thrilling. So that could be one that we might choose. Similarly, we might talk about this moment where Mr. Fisher starts to read Tibbitt's work and there's a change in focus because it now focuses instead of on the boring marking that he's doing, but actually on the physical experience of marking something so exciting. So we have a choice to make there. So I have chosen the second paragraph where he goes back with a flashback in time, and this is the paragraph that I've used to demonstrate it. The writer changes the focus in line 9 from the mundane experiences of Mr. Fisher's current teaching job to those days in the past which seemed to Mr. Fisher to have been much more exciting. The writer juxtaposes the quiet and dull routine of the teacher with the memories of the past that seem to explode with fun and excitement, space adventures, giant apes. This flashback, this is one of the bits of terminology that I keep mentioning, this flashback of memory creates a brutal contrast, also terminology, that only emphasises how poor and badly written the student's stories are and further highlights Mr. Fisher's sense of disillusionment. It implies he will never read a student's story that is any good ever again. This makes the impact of the Tibbett story that much more dramatic later on. So we've got the what is the focus change, or the change of focus is from something to something. So it changes the focus from the mundane experiences to the past. So we know what we're changing from and what we're changing to, and this is the explanation about why that might be. Okay, so returning to the bullet point on the question, we know that we've done bullet point 1 and bullet point 2 there, so we now need to think about any other structural features that might interest us. So because we haven't covered this element here about the physical manifestations of Tibbitt's homework, we could cover that, but we could also cover something about this this part here where he has to reread it and doesn't really sort of follow what's going on. He's so shocked by the story that he's read. So we have a choice to make there about which one we do. So my decision was to look at the final paragraph, which is here, and to try and understand why the writer structures it in that way in terms of the final part of the extract. So having been bored, marking in the form room, struggling with disillusionment, Mr. Fisher then reads Tibbet's homework. He's physically affected by that homework and cannot quite believe that he's had the luck to be able to find something so fantastic. So the writer then concludes with this paragraph here. If anyone had asked him what Tibbet's story was about, Mr. Fisher might have been hard put to reply, which is interesting because either he hasn't, it hasn't affected him that much. Obviously, he would have remembered what it was about, but maybe he was so shocked that's the reason why he didn't remember. There were themes he recognised, elements of plot which were vaguely familiar, an adventure, a quest, a child, a man. But to explain to Tibbet's story in these terms was as meaningless as trying to describe a loved one's face in terms of nose, eyes, mouth. This was something new, something entirely original. So I'm interested in this in terms of the fact that it goes even beyond Mr. Fisher's flashbacks, memories of stories gone by, and that suggests that this piece of work is more than shocking. Okay, so let's have a look at the paragraph for that particular final part of question 3. So topic starter, finally, the writer returns our focus being one of the key words in this question 3. Finally, the writer returns our focus once Fisher has read the story to Mr. Fisher's struggle to even capture the sense of the story. This struggle is presented by the writer in the triple phrases, a quest, a child, a man. So the triple there is a structural device. And this emphasises how lost for words Mr. Fisher is. The simple sentence, also terminology there, something entirely original, indicates that even though his earlier flashback, technique terminology, showed how familiar he was with stories of old, this story is even better than those of old. The effect of this is to underline Mr. Fisher's shock, but also to prove his prejudices about the boys in his class wrong, that they are capable of new and original stories. So I've talked about the what, in terms of what's the focus here in this particular paragraph, and the technique, and why, what's the effect. So 3 paragraphs for question 3, focusing in on the 3 bullet points as we've got here. What does the writer focus our attention on at the beginning? How and why the change of focus, and any other structural features that interest you. And we've gone to into quite some detail here in terms of the structure of the story, and that's what we need to attempt to do in question 3. What we shouldn't be doing is summarising. What we should be doing is focusing in on what the writer is showing us and why are they showing us that in that particular order. Okay, so what I'm going to ask you to do now, please, is to have a look back at your own question 3 and to improve question 3 in your exercise books in red pen to incorporate some improvement into question 3.